My name is Claire Bennett, and I am 32 years old, and for 11 years, I let my own family call me a liar. 2 nights before my wedding, at the rehearsal dinner, my mother stood up with a glass of wine in her hand, and she looked straight at the man I was about to marry. She said, "Daniel deserves to know the truth about the baby she threw away." The room went silent. 40 guests, and not one of them seemed to breathe. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice, and I did not cry. I set down my fork, I folded my napkin, and I pressed both hands flat against the tablecloth, because if I had not held on to something, my hands would have started to shake. My mother thought she had won. She thought she had found the one sentence that would make Daniel stand up and walk out of my life for good. What none of them knew was that I had waited 11 years for someone to finally say those words out loud, in a room full of witnesses. And she did not know that the girl at the center of her lie was standing just outside the door, in a dark green dress, holding a folder the two of us had packed that afternoon. Because the child they always said I abandoned was never mine to begin with. And the truth of who that girl really belonged to was about to walk through that door and introduce herself to every person my parents had spent a decade deceiving. They had finally made one mistake. They told the lie in front of Daniel's mother, and in front of 40 people who could hear every word. To understand how I ended up at that table, silent, steady, and for the first time in my life unafraid, I have to take you back 11 years, to the winter, when the shape of my life was decided for me, in a room I was not allowed to speak in. To understand the toast, you first have to understand the family that raised the hand holding the glass. The Bennetts were the kind of family that measured love in appearances and counted worth in what the neighbors assumed. My father, Richard Bennett, ran an accounting firm called Bennett and Associates out on Delmar Avenue, and he treated our family name like a product he was personally selling. My mother, Diane, kept our house on Ashcombe Lane like a furniture showroom, and she kept her 2 children arranged the very same way. There were 2 of us, my older brother Marcus, and me. Marcus was the child they polished, and I was the child they used to make him shine. By the time Marcus was 21, he was in his 2nd year of law school, and my parents said his name the way other people talk about weather they are grateful for. I was 21 that same winter, working the front desk at a dental office on Route 9, and paying my own rent on a studio above a laundromat. Nobody in my family ever once asked how I paid it. They only asked about Marcus, his grades, his internship, his future, and his girlfriend from the good family 2 towns over. So when Marcus got a different girl pregnant, a waitress named Nadia from near his campus, the family did not treat it as Marcus making a mistake. They treated it as a threat to the product. I remember the meeting because I was summoned to it like an employee, on a Sunday, in the formal dining room we were never allowed to use. My father sat at the head of the table with a yellow legal pad in front of him, as if my brother's child were a tax problem he could restructure. My mother poured coffee for everyone but me, and Marcus sat there with his head down, letting them decide what would happen to a baby that was not even born yet. The plan they landed on was simple, and it was cruel, and it was aimed at me. Marcus could not be the young man who fathered a child out of wedlock, because that story would follow him into every interview, every clerkship, and every courtroom for the rest of his career. But the family could survive a daughter who did something foolish, because a daughter like me was already, in their minds, a disappointment they had budgeted for. So they asked me to say the baby was mine. They asked me to tell anyone who ever wondered that I had gotten pregnant, that I had panicked, and that I had given the child away to strangers. I want to be honest about why I did not refuse that night, because I have turned it over in my mind for 11 years. I was 21, I was broke, I was afraid of my father, and I still believed, somewhere deep and foolish, that if I did this one enormous thing for them, they would finally love me the way they loved Marcus. So I said yes. And the moment I said yes, my mother smiled at me for the first time in months, and I hated how much that smile still meant to me. If you are watching this, and you have ever sat silent at a family table, while the people who were supposed to protect you rewrote your whole life to suit their comfort? Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. And stay with me, because the choice I made that winter is the exact reason I can finally tell this story out loud. There is one more thing you need to know before I go on, and it is the seed of everything that happened at that rehearsal dinner. That same night, before I drove home, I did something I never told a single one of them about. I took my father's legal pad while he walked my mother to the kitchen, and I photographed every page with my phone. Then I started a folder, and over the next 11 years that folder never stopped growing, and my family never once suspected that it existed. The baby was born that following March, a girl, and Nadia named her Lily. And the plan my family designed for one awkward season quietly became the architecture of my entire adult life. The story spread exactly the way my parents wanted it to spread. At every holiday, at every wedding, and at every funeral, some relative would lower their voice and mention, so very sadly, that poor Claire had a baby at 21 and simply gave it away. My Aunt Carol stopped introducing me to people at parties. My grandmother, before she died, told me she prayed for my soul, and she meant it as a kindness. I lost a good man over it too, a high school teacher named Paul, whom I dated at 24. When my mother met Paul, she took him aside, and she warned him, gently, sweetly, that I had a history of walking away from things that mattered most. Paul started watching me differently after that lunch, and 3 weeks later he stopped calling, and I never told him the truth, because the truth was not mine to tell. The lie cost me far more than a name and a boyfriend, because my family learned to reach for it whenever they wanted to deny me something. When my grandmother died, she left a small inheritance, $18,000, to be divided among the grandchildren. My father decided, on his own, that my share should go to Marcus instead, because, as he said at the reading, a woman who abandons a baby cannot be trusted with money. I did not receive a single dollar, and I did not argue, because arguing would have meant explaining, and explaining would have broken my promise. 2 years later, at Marcus's own wedding, they seated me at the very back table, beside the kitchen doors, next to a cousin nobody else wanted near them. During his toast, my father raised his glass, and he called me, in front of 300 guests, our Claire, who has had her struggles, but whom we have never stopped loving. People nodded at me with that soft, pitying face, and I smiled back, and I cut my cake, and I said absolutely nothing. That was the price of the lie, paid quietly, year after year, in small public humiliations that everyone simply accepted as fact. Once, when I was 26, I came very close to telling the truth. I sat my mother down at her kitchen table, and I told her I could not keep living inside a story that was not mine. She did not shout, because my mother never once shouted. She simply reminded me, in a flat and pleasant voice, that Marcus had co-signed my apartment lease years before, and that families who embarrass each other sometimes stop helping each other. Then she asked whether I truly wanted to be the woman who destroyed her own brother out of spite. I drove home that night, and I did not raise the subject again for 6 more years. That is how the lie survived, not through one loud threat, but through 100 quiet ones, delivered gently, over coffee. I did not fight any of it, because I had signed up for it, and because Marcus had begged me in the driveway that winter, with real tears on his face, and because I had loved my brother. But here is the part my parents never planned for. Nadia, Lily's mother, was not built for the life she had been handed, and when Lily was 2 years old, Nadia left her with her own mother, a woman named Rosa Delgado, in a narrow house on Fairview Street. And then Nadia stopped coming back. My parents sent Rosa money, to keep the silence, a check every quarter, and they considered the whole matter closed. They never planned to lay eyes on that child again. But I did. The first time I drove to Fairview Street, Lily was 3, and she was sitting on the porch steps in a yellow raincoat, with no rain anywhere in sight. I told Rosa I was the aunt, which was the only true thing anyone in my family had said about that child in years, and I started showing up. I want to be very specific about what showing up actually meant, because the specifics are the entire point of this story. On the first day of every month, for 11 years, I sent Rosa $300, first by paper check and later by transfer, out of an account my parents did not know I had. I never missed a birthday once, and I mailed a card every single year, 14 cards in all, which Rosa kept in a shoebox on top of her refrigerator. I sat in a metal folding chair at Lily's kindergarten graduation, at her 4th grade science fair, and at a middle school choir concert where she sang second from the left and watched the doors the whole time to see if anyone had come for her. I had come for her. I was the woman in the back row, every time, in a coat that did not match the good clothes my family wore. There were harder nights too, the kind that never fit on a birthday card. When Lily was 7, she spiked a fever of 104 on a Tuesday at midnight, and Rosa called me in tears, because her old car would not start. I drove 40 minutes through the rain, carried Lily to my back seat wrapped in a blanket, and sat in the emergency room until 4 in the morning, holding her hand while she slept. When Lily was 11, a boy at school called her a cruel name about having no real parents, and she shoved him, and the school suspended her for 3 days. I was the one who sat across from the principal and explained, without breaking Rosa's privacy, that this child had more people quietly loving her than the paperwork could ever show. None of the Bennetts ever knew about those nights, because none of the Bennetts ever thought to ask. To them, Lily was a closed file in a drawer, and I was the woman they had trained the whole family to pity. And with every visit, my folder quietly grew. I saved the birth certificate that named Marcus Bennett as the father, because Rosa had a copy, and she handed it to me without a second thought. I saved my mother's letter, printed on Bennett and Associates letterhead, the one that told me in writing to, and I am quoting it exactly, "Say the child is yours, and spare your brother a ruined life." I saved 11 years of bank statements, every transfer highlighted in yellow. I saved the photographs, the choir programs, and a drawing Lily made me at 6, of a woman in a purple coat labeled, in careful letters, Aunt Claire. I told myself I was saving all of it for Lily someday, so that when she was old enough to ask who she really was, at least one person could hand her the truth, instead of a rumor. I did not yet understand that I would one day need that same folder to save myself. If you have ever been the one blamed for someone else's mistake, simply because you were the easiest person in the family to sacrifice, then you already know the exact weight I am describing, and I would truly like to know in the comments whether you carried it in silence too. Then, 3 years ago, on a rainy Thursday, I met Daniel Hollis. Daniel was a pediatric nurse who had become a nurse manager at the Children's Hospital downtown, and he was the first person who ever asked me a real question and then actually waited for my answer. I fell in love with the way he was gentle without ever being weak. When he proposed, on a Tuesday, in my kitchen, with a ring he had clearly been carrying around for a week, I said yes before he even finished the sentence. And that, more than anything else, is when my parents changed toward me. For 11 years, they had wanted me quiet and ashamed and close, exactly where they could manage me. But an engaged Claire was a Claire who might build a life outside their reach, a Claire with a husband and in-laws and her own family standing behind her. And there was something else, something with a deadline. Marcus had just been put forward for a family court judgeship, and a family court judge cannot have a secret daughter living on Fairview Street. My freedom had suddenly become dangerous to their story. So my mother began, slowly and carefully, to poison the ground before I could ever stand on it. She invited Daniel to lunch without me, not once but twice, at the country club where the staff all knew her name. She told Daniel's mother, Susan, over coffee, that our family had suffered a great private sorrow involving me and a child, and that she only raised it out of love for everyone's happiness. She was building the frame early, on purpose, so that if the truth about Marcus and Lily ever surfaced, it would already look like my shame, and never like his. Then she went a step further, and this is the moment I knew she would never stop. 10 days before the wedding, she mailed Daniel an unsigned card with a single line inside that read, Ask her what she did in the spring of the year she turned 21. Daniel showed it to me the same night it arrived, because Daniel, unlike everyone in my family, did not keep secrets in the dark. 3 days before the rehearsal, my mother did something that turned my fear into something colder and far steadier. She drove to Fairview Street herself, for the first time in 12 years, and she knocked on Rosa's front door. She offered Rosa $5,000, in cash, to take Lily out of town for the week of my wedding, so that no one would ever have to look at her. Rosa, who had raised that girl on almost nothing, closed the door in my mother's face, and then she called me, and she repeated every single word. That was the moment I stopped being afraid of losing my family, because I finally understood that I had never truly had one. And 2 nights before the wedding, at the rehearsal dinner she had insisted on hosting and paying for, she decided to drive the final nail in front of the largest audience she could gather. The turning point did not happen at that dinner. It happened 4 days before it, on a Wednesday afternoon, in Rosa Delgado's small kitchen on Fairview Street. Lily was 14 now, tall, quiet, and watchful, in the exact way that I had been at her age. She had known for 2 years that Marcus was her father, because Rosa and I had decided together that she was old enough for the truth, and she had taken it with a steadiness that broke my heart in half. That Wednesday, she slid a folded piece of paper across the kitchen table toward me. It was a wedding invitation, my wedding invitation, which my mother had mailed to Rosa's house by mistake, meant for a different relative farther down that same street. Lily looked at me, and she asked a question that I will carry for the rest of my life. She said, "Are they going to let me exist at your wedding, or am I still just the secret?" And something inside me, something folded up and put away for 11 years, finally stood up straight. I realized that I had spent my entire adult life protecting everyone in that family, except the one person who had never done a single thing wrong. I had protected Marcus, who fathered her and then vanished. I had protected my parents, who erased her and paid to keep her quiet. I had protected the family name, the same name that had never once bothered to protect me. But I had never once protected Lily's simple right to be a real person, in daylight, with a name and a chair at the table. So I made a decision, and I made it out loud, right there in that kitchen, so that I could never quietly take it back. I told Lily that she was not a secret, that she had never been a secret, and that she was going to come to the rehearsal dinner as exactly who she was. Then I drove home, and I opened the folder for the first time in years, and I laid every single piece of it out across my living room floor: the birth certificate, the letter on the company letterhead, the highlighted bank statements, the 14 cards, the drawing of the woman in the purple coat. I did not build a speech that night, because I did not need one. The truth had already written itself, 11 years earlier, in my own mother's handwriting, and all I had to do now was stop hiding it. Daniel found me on the floor, surrounded by all that paper, and I told him everything, every part of it: the Sunday meeting, the lie, the money, and the girl. He did not flinch, and he did not pity me, which was somehow far better than either. He asked me only one question. He said, "What do you need from me on Friday night?" And I told him the truth, because he had earned it. I said, "I need you to not stop me, no matter what she says." Daniel nodded once, and then he asked me if Lily understood what she was walking into. I told him that Lily had asked to come, that she had helped me choose which pages to carry, and that she had picked the green dress herself. He said that any girl brave enough to walk into that room deserved to walk in beside people who would never make her a secret again. Then we packed the folder together, page by page, at my kitchen table, and neither of us slept much that night. The rehearsal dinner was held in the private back room at Marchetti's, the old Italian restaurant on Bellamy Street, under a low ceiling and warm yellow lights. 40 people were there, and most of them came from Daniel's side, because my side had always been small and careful and quiet. My mother wore navy, my father wore his good gray suit, and Marcus sat near the head of the table, with the calm, untouched face of a man who had never once paid for anything. I had asked Rosa to bring Lily at 8 o'clock and to wait with her in the small front lobby until I sent word. I spent the first hour of that dinner being warm to everyone, on purpose, because I wanted every guest in that room fully present, fully relaxed, and fully paying attention when it finally happened. At 8:15, my mother tapped her glass with a spoon, and she rose to give her toast, and I felt the entire room turn toward her, like flowers turning toward a lamp. She thanked Daniel's family for their warmth. She said a few graceful words about love, and about second chances, and about the mercy of family. And then, because my mother could never once resist the kill, she looked directly at Daniel, and she said the sentence I began this whole story with. She said, "Daniel deserves to know the truth about the baby she threw away." The room went cold, and still, and quiet, exactly the way she had wanted it to. Susan Hollis slowly set down her glass. Daniel's father frowned, and looked at me, and my mother turned toward me, with a look of soft, victorious sorrow on her face, ready to explain, so gently, that her poor daughter simply had a painful past. I stood up, not fast, not loud, and not angry, just steady, and I said, "You are right, Mom. Daniel does deserve the truth. So does everyone in this room. Let us finally tell it, all of it." I watched the first flicker of real fear cross her face. I turned toward the doorway, and I nodded once, and Lily walked in. She walked to the center of that room, in her dark green dress, holding the folder against her chest, 14 years old, and braver than every grown adult in my family had ever been. A ripple moved through the room, because every guest could see, in a single instant, the resemblance nobody had ever been allowed to notice. She had Marcus's dark eyes, and Marcus's straight, heavy brow, and she stood with the very same square shoulders my brother had. Somewhere to my left, one of Daniel's aunts whispered, "Oh my God," and pressed a hand over her mouth. I said, "Everyone, I would like you to meet Lily. She is 14 years old, and she is not the child I abandoned, because I have never had a child of my own." Then I began to lay it out, and I did it slowly, one piece at a time, because 11 years of silence deserves to be broken piece by piece. I took the first page out of the folder, and I placed it flat on the tablecloth, directly in front of my mother. "This is Lily's birth certificate," I said. "Read the name printed in the box marked Father," and the name printed in that box, for everyone to see, was Marcus Bennett. Marcus lifted his head at the sound of his own name. I laid the second page down beside the first. "This is a letter, printed on Dad's company letterhead, in your handwriting, Mom, telling me to say the baby was mine, to spare my brother a ruined life." My father half rose from his chair, and he said my name once, low, like a warning that no longer carried any weight in the room. I did not stop. I set the third stack down, thick and yellow with highlighter. "These are 11 years of bank records, $300, on the first of every month, sent from me to the grandmother who actually raised this girl, while all of you pretended she did not exist." Then I laid the cards down, one after another, 14 envelopes in a slow row across the white cloth. "And these are the birthday cards I mailed her, every single year, while the whole town whispered that I was the one who walked away from a child." Then I placed one last thing on the table, smaller than everything else. It was a child's drawing, a woman in a purple coat, with the words "Aunt Claire" written underneath, in the careful letters of a 6-year-old. I said, "She drew this for me when she was 6. This is who I was to her, while all of you decided that she was nobody." The drawing sat there on the white cloth, brighter than every document beside it, and somehow it was the piece that finally broke the room. Marcus finally spoke, and his voice cracked in the middle. He said, "Claire, you agreed. You agreed to this. You said yes." And I looked at my brother, the almost judge, and I said the truest thing I have ever said. I was 21, and I was afraid of the same people you were afraid of. The difference is that I spent 11 years driving to Fairview Street. What did you ever do for her, except let me pay for your silence? Marcus put his face in both of his hands, and he did not lift it again. My Aunt Carol, the same aunt who had stopped introducing me at parties, reached out with a shaking hand, picked up the letter on the letterhead, read it in silence, and then set it down as if it had burned her fingers. Daniel's grandmother, a small woman of 80 who had barely spoken all evening, looked up from the far end of the table. She said, "Read it out loud. If it was written, then it can be read." So I read it out loud, every line of it, in my mother's own words, including the sentence where she told me to spare my brother a ruined life. By the time I reached the end of that letter, 2 of Daniel's aunts were quietly crying, and my father had stopped trying to speak. My mother reached across the table and tried to gather the pages back into a pile, the way she had gathered every inconvenient truth for 11 years. But Daniel stepped forward, and he laid his hand flat on top of the documents. He said, very calmly, "No, these stay on the table." It was the first time in my entire life that anyone had put themselves between me and my family, and I very nearly lost my composure right there. My father found his voice one last time, and he aimed it at the room instead of at me. He said, "This is a private family matter, and it does not belong at this table." And Susan Hollis, still holding on to my hand, answered him before I could even open my mouth. She said, "It stopped being private the moment your wife made it a toast." Nobody in the Bennett family had anything left to say after that. The room was so quiet that I could hear the kitchen doors swinging behind us, and the small sound of Susan Hollis beginning to cry. My mother tried, one last time, to reach for the story she had controlled for so long. She said, softly, to the table, "This is not what it looks like. She is confused. She always exaggerates." But nobody at that table was looking at me anymore. They were looking at the birth certificate, and the letter in her own handwriting, and the 14 cards, and the 14-year-old girl standing calmly in the middle of it all. Lily looked slowly around that silent room, at all of those staring adults, and she said the only words she spoke the entire night. She said, "I always knew who came to my recitals. It was her. It was always her, not one of you." I turned to my mother, and for the first time in my whole life, I did not need her to smile at me. I said, "I am done carrying your lie. It was never mine to carry, and it ends tonight, in front of every witness that you invited yourself." For a long moment, nobody in that room moved at all. Then Lily crossed the floor, came and stood beside me, and slipped her hand into mine, in full view of the family that had spent 14 years pretending she did not exist. And I held on, because this time I was not gripping the edge of a table to keep myself upright. This time I was holding the one person who had always been worth the wait. The consequences did not require a single act of revenge from me, because the truth, once it is finally out in the open, does its own patient work. Susan Hollis crossed the room, took both of my hands in hers, and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, that she had never in her life been prouder to gain a daughter. Daniel's father quietly picked up the birth certificate, read it twice, and then set it back down like it was made of glass. Marcus lost the judgeship within a month, and I never reported a single thing, because a room full of witnesses talks on its own. A family court judge cannot be a man who let his own sister take the blame for the child he abandoned, and the nominating committee understood that within days. He also lost the fiancé from the Good family, 2 towns over, who had apparently been told a very different story about the kind of man she was marrying. My father's firm did not collapse, but the truth followed the Bennett name through every country club, church committee, and dinner party it had ever tried so hard to impress. For once, the family name told people the truth about the family. My mother called me 11 times in the weeks that followed. I did not answer, not out of cruelty, but because I had finally learned the difference between a mother and a manager, and I no longer worked there. Rosa Delgado was invited to my wedding as an honored guest, and seated in the front row, exactly where she had always belonged. And Lily, the girl they had spent 14 years erasing, was written into my life in permanent ink. I married Daniel that Sunday, in a small stone church, with the right people in the front row, and the truth finally sitting in the seat where the shame used to sit. Lily was my maid of honor, in the same dark green dress she had worn to the dinner, because she told me it had become her lucky dress, and I was in no position to argue with that. People sometimes ask me if I regret giving up 11 years, to protect a family that would have thrown me away without a second thought, and my answer tends to surprise them. I do not regret the years I spent driving to Fairview Street, because those years were never really about my family at all. They were about a small girl in a yellow raincoat who deserved at least one person who would keep coming back. Here is what those 11 years taught me, and it is the one thing I truly want you to take away from this story. Family is not the people who share your last name and spend your loyalty like it costs them nothing. Family is the people who show up in the folding chairs, who mail the card every year, and who stand in a doorway in a green dress and refuse to be a secret any longer. The people who ask you to carry their shame are not protecting you, and if you are honest with yourself, you already know that they never were. And the moment you finally set that weight down, in the light, in front of witnesses, you will discover at last how heavy it truly was, and how much of your own life had been waiting quietly underneath it. I stopped being my family's lie the night I said it out loud, and that was the very same night that I finally became my own.